Добрый вечер, добро пожаловать. Good evening and welcome, welcome. Thank you all for coming to this Russian Now panel. My name is Alla Epsteyn. I'm a senior lecturer in the Russian department. Today, September 20th, is day 574 since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. On behalf of my colleagues on the panel, I want to express our condemnation of Russia's military assault on Ukraine and our solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are suffering Russia's ongoing brutal and unjustified military onslaught. Today's panel is the first in a series of very exciting events planned by the Russian Department and Russian Area Studies program this semester. Next week, on Monday, September 25th, Kate Nikitska, who was a 2022-23 Ukraine Fellow at the Wellesley College's Susie Newhouse Center for the Humanities, she will be giving a Zoom lecture from Kiev on the tradition of the Gilgamesh epic, on the translation of the Gilgamesh epic done by Nikolai Gumilev, a brilliant early 20th century Russian poet. Please join the Zoom on Monday, September 25th at 7:30. Our next event, a Roma guitar ensemble, Zingareska, will be in residency at Wellesley College during the very first week of October. They will give a public lecture, they will give a public concert on Wednesday, October the 4th at 7 p.m. And we also invite you to the film screening of Gypsy Bengerka on October 5th at 7 p.m. On Friday, October 6th, they will visit my Russian language classes and Professor Tumarkin's history class. Ronald Suni, Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History of the University of Chicago, will give a lecture on imperial overreach, Putin's Russia as empire, on Thursday, October 12th at 8 o'clock, right here in the library lecture room. Professor Suni's latest book is Stalin, Passage to Revolution. And in mid-October, we are inviting Vera Pavlova, a famous Moscow poet, now living outside of the Russian Federation, to give a poetry recital. This is going to be a very exciting and wonderful event. Definitely do not miss it. And please, just in general, keep your eyes open for more information about these events. So, Russia Now panel in September is a long-standing tradition of the Russian Area Studies program. August is famously the most tragic month in Russia, and August 2023 was no different. There were some crushing events, including a soul-crushing news of extended jail term for political prisoner and Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, a failed Russia's moon mission when Luna 25 crashed into the moon and delivered a major blow to Russian space prestige, and finally, a private jet crash with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the infamous chief of the Wagner private military company, who led an aborted mutiny against Russia's armed forces in June. On today's panel, our three experts, Professors Thomas Hodge of the Russian Department, Valerie Sperling, Political Science, Clark University, and our own Nina Tumarkin from the History Department, will shed light on the current state of Russia, the international pariah headed by its determined leader, President Vladimir Putin. What are the Kremlin's goals as it continues its merciless attacks on Ukrainian military and civilian targets? How are the Russian people facing down the realities of war and economic sanctions? How should we understand this past summer's attempted military rebellion and its leader's recent death in a plane crash? Why are so many people serving Stalin-era sentences for spreading fake news about a war that is forbidden to be called a war? What role does gender play in the recent conservative term in Russia's domestic politics? And how the war affected the current art scene in Russia? So after all three presentations, we'll open the floor for questions and discussions. So hold your questions until all three presenters have finished their talks. Our first presenter tonight is Thomas Hodge, my colleague and professor of Russian from the Russian department. He devoted most of his research to the nexus of Russian literature and Russian music in the 1800s, and to the history of 19th century Russian nature writing and hunting literature. His most recent work is a book-length analysis of Turgenev as a nature writer, Hunting Nature, Ivan Turgenev and the Organic World, published in 2020 by Cornell University Press. An authorized Russian translation of the book «Природа охотника и органический мир» was published in 2022 by Academic Studies Press, Bibliorusica. Please welcome Professor Hodge.
Thank you very much, Alla, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, audience, for being here. It's great to see you. I'm just going to take a second to go ahead and get my act together with the presentation that I wanted to put up on the screen for you today. And I hope that will be visible. So my day job here at Wellesley College is to teach Russian language and literature. So when we have these panel presentations every year at this time, I usually cover the arts beat, and that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'd like to spend 10 or 15 minutes offering some illustrated comments that are not directly about the war that's taking place on the ground where people are suffering and dying, but instead a sort of proxy war, a metaphorical war that is taking place in the West and elsewhere that is sort of being played out among artists and singers and writers. Now, I'd like to begin by just showing you an example of how savvy Vladimir Putin has been as an exploiter of artistic excellence in his country. Like the sort of expert strongman politician that he is, he understands that the cultural capital that is developed by extremely talented artists, and by that I mean musicians, people who are in the arts in general, people in film, etc., dancers. He understands that this brings tremendous prestige to his country, and he exploits these people very deftly. So, for example, this is how many are up there? 7 prominent pro-Putin artists in the Russian Federation. I won't name them all or go through them all. Maybe you've heard of some of these people, maybe you haven't. I'm mostly tonight going to focus on the music scene. The 2 people who are up there, who are probably the most well-known, are Valery Gergiev over here on the upper left, and this film director and actor on the other side, whose name is Nikita Mikhalkov. All of those people, except, it turns out, for Mikhalkov and Valentina Lisitsa, the pianist, signed the March 2014 open letter supporting President Putin and the Russian Federation's annexation of Crimea back then. Okay, so this is really 9 years ago we're talking about, and I think we're going to need to focus a little bit on what was happening almost a decade ago. Now, the pianist Valentina Lisitsa has since that time become very famous and infamous. She sort of made her own reputation by posting YouTube videos of herself playing music, mostly Russian piano music. And it turns out that even though she was born in Ukraine, in Kiev, she is a sort of viciously nationalistic, pro-Putin voice on the world stage. And there's this kind of almost surreal footage that emerged in May of 2022 of her taking a piano at the edge of the bombed out city of Mariupol. You remember what happened in Mariupol that spring. The entire city was pulverized, and it depends on whose statistics you look at it, anywhere between 1,500 and 25,000 human beings were killed. And there she is with other pro-separatist, pro-Russian, pro-Putin citizens standing there singing День Победы, the day of victory. It's almost ridiculously ghoulish. I don't want to dwell on her. Instead, what I'd like to do tonight is focus on another artist, a singer, who is not as unsubtle as somebody like Valentina Lisitsa, who seems almost deranged, but instead someone who is so talented that she found herself being exploited for Putin's purposes and made some compromises and now is in a very odd and difficult position. And you can make up your own minds of how you feel about her. But to talk about this, we need to go back to the time of the Winter Olympics in Sochi in early 2014. The opening ceremony was at the beginning of February. You may recall that it was boycotted by many Westerners, Western officials, because the previous year Russia had passed its infamous anti-gay propaganda legislation. And this had created quite a controversy at the time. 2.5 weeks later, at the closing ceremony, even more momentous events were taking place. So as the Russians were sort of celebrating their own country and celebrating the Olympic Games in Sochi on the Black Sea, the Euromaidan was taking place and the Revolution of Dignity. They reach a climax that same week in the closing of the Olympics. The pro-Moscow president Yanukovych flees from Ukraine the 21st. On the 27th, Russian forces seize the Crimean Peninsula, and Russia very quickly formally incorporates Crimea on the 18th of March. All of this is happening during this huge national self-congratulation that Russia engaged in at the Olympiad. Now, at the opening ceremony, you will see that the pro-Putin artists had a very prominent position. And you know, these opening Olympic ceremonies are always sort of jingoistic festivals, and this is no exception, but it seemed that there were particularly carefully picked or chosen people, Russians, to carry the Olympic flag, not the Russian flag, but here the Olympic flag, including Valery Gergiev, the extremely talented conductor, mostly a Russian repertoire, and Nikita Mikhalkov. So there they are carrying the Olympic flag, and in the image on the right, you can see that the Russian flag gets hoisted first, and that's the usual custom at the Olympics, and then after that, the Olympic flag goes up. As the Olympic flag goes up, normally it's customary at these ceremonies for the Olympic hymn to be sung. And it was here by a surprise guest, this soprano, and she sang the Olympic hymn in Russian translation. So there she is, accompanied by the men in the white suits, that male chorus who are backing her up in her solo. That's quite a voice. Some of you are probably already recognizing her. You'll notice that over on the other side of the stage, if I can point it out, you'll see the group of flag bearers are standing there, and Valery Gergiev, the famous conductor, is all the way kind of out of view, but he's sharing the stage with that woman whose name is Anna Netrebko. And if you are an opera fan, you've heard this name because she is, in the last, say, 2 decades, she has been the diva of all divas. One of the most talented opera singers who's emerged in the last half century. Valery Gergiev has been associated with her for a long time. In fact, he discovered her at the St. Petersburg Conservatory way back in 1993, famously when she was working as a work-study student at the conservatory, mopping floors, and she won a singing prize. He heard this and said, wait a minute, who is this? And then the rest is history. She became the most famous opera singer, really probably of her own lifetime. She calls him her godfather. So who is this Anna Netrebko? Well, she was born in 1971 in Krasnodar, in the far southern border country of Russia. It's circled in red on the lower right-hand side of that map. You'll notice that Krasnodar is very close to the Crimean Peninsula. In fact, it's sort of right there, situated in the gateway to the Kerch Strait, where there is now a bridge that Putin has built. The Ukrainians, during the war, have been successfully attacking that bridge. Maybe you've read about this in the paper. So she is actually, on her father's side, a Cossack, a Kuban Cossack, and very proudly so. And that's her father Yuri in the middle, and her sister Natalia. And there's her dad turning something like, I think, 84 back in 2019. A few more facts about her. She's married to a quite famous tenor, an Azerbaijani tenor, whose name is Evazov. Netrebko holds both Russian and Austrian citizenship, and she lives in Vienna, where she's very popular. She debuts at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City in 2002 in the famous role of Natasha in Prokofiev's opera War and Peace. And in fact, we had a Wellesley field trip to go see that production, and we actually heard Netrebko sing that role back then. She becomes the Met's top female star until March of 2022, when she gives almost 200 Met performances over the span of 20 years. She really becomes the banner performer at the Metropolitan Opera in that time. And she frequently gets called the Beyonce of classical music. I'm sorry, but that phrase is out there. So all of this is fine if she simply sticks to her singing, but it hasn't been that simple for Netrebko. So let's talk about her entanglements with politics a little bit. It really gets started back in 2008 when Vladimir Putin gives her the Narodny Artist Award, the People's Artist Award, and you can see that photo of him right there. Already he understands that he needs to groom this person as someone who can provide legitimacy for him and give him support later when he needs it. 4 years later, she publicly endorses Putin's election to the office of president, calling him a very attractive man and noting his strong male energy. I know. And then a couple of years later, she was singing at the Sochi Olympics, the clip I showed you. It gets much worse that same year. At the end of 2014, she's photographed in the breakaway Republic of Donetsk, holding up the flag of Novorossiya, which is the sort of self-proclaimed state, short-lived republic, alleged republic, which was pro-Russian and wanted to invite the Russian troops in to defend it, and with its leader, Oleg Tsaryov, who is now an outlaw in the eyes of the Ukrainian government. He's a wanted man. There she is in that photo, holding up the flag of that breakaway republic. She claimed later that she didn't know what she was doing. She had gone there to make a donation to the opera company, and then somebody handed her a flag and she held it up. And so she had a lot of excuses, but the photo is there. And it has followed her around relentlessly. 3 years later, she tells a Russian news agency in the run-up to the 2018 election for president, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin suits me fine. God give him health and strength. It's impossible to think of a better president for Russia, especially now. So God keep him healthy in maintaining the very complicated defense of Russia, which he does so wonderfully. Now, much closer to the present day, we get down to the real business that's gotten her into tremendous trouble, and understandably so. So 2 days after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, she posts on Instagram in Russian. Now, there's an official English translation that's issued at the same time, and that English translation says, "I am opposed to this war. I am Russian and I love my country, but I have many friends in Ukraine, and the pain and suffering right now breaks my heart. I want this war to end and for people to be able to live in peace." And that sounds pretty good, but when I read the Russian original, I was very disappointed, because all it really says in Russian is "Я против войны." And anybody can say "Я против войны." I mean, Putin can probably say "Я против войны." I am against war. I am against the war. It's very different from the way it was presented in English, which was "I am against this war." But she didn't say that. She didn't say "Я против этой войны." So it was a bit of an example of a Weasley, possibly deliberate translation into English. This put her on a collision course with the man on the left. This is Peter Gelb, who is the general manager of the Metropolitan Opera, one of the most important big shots in the arts in the United States, and certainly in New York City. He's been there for a long time, since 2006. Also, incidentally, and it's relevant as you'll see later, his wife happens to be a very talented conductor. His name is Carrie Lynn Wilson. She's Canadian, Ukrainian background, and she also was essentially responsible for the creation of something called the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra in 2022. So these personal connections, I think, do become relevant, as we'll see. So we can start following what happens next simply by looking at the headlines. So here we are, February 27th, so this is one day after that Instagram post. the Metropolitan Opera makes an announcement that it's going to cut ties with pro-Putin artists. So in other words, if people are going to continue to endorse Putin, the Met's not going to have anything to do with them. The other shoe drops very soon thereafter. So by March 3rd, a few days later, Anna Netrebko is terminated at the Met for 2 seasons. And Gelb says it is a great artistic loss for the Met, and that's true, because she was incredibly talented, and for opera. Anna is one of the greatest singers in Met history, this is true. But with Putin killing innocent victims in Ukraine, there was no way forward. So, all this time people were trying to say, look, you need to come out and explicitly condemn the war and explicitly condemn Putin who's leading the war, and she never would. So, she sort of hemmed and hawed and kind of went into hiding for a while, and a little less than a month later she tries to distance herself, but by then it's too late. You can kind of see the sorts of statements she was making. She says, no, I didn't really know Putin, I only met him a few times, I didn't really mean it. You know, look, I do condemn this war, but by then people just really didn't believe it, especially given her track record of cozying up to Putin in the preceding 15 years. So how does the Met respond? They replaced Netrebko in her role as Turandot with a really talented Ukrainian diva, and her name is Lyudmila Monastyrska, and at her curtain call, when she first performed the role on May 1st, she wrapped herself in a Ukrainian flag. Now, who is this Lyudmila Monastyrska? There she is, she's a few years younger than Netrebko. She's also got a long history with the Met, not as long or quite as illustrious as Netrebko's, and her husband is also an opera singer who's based in Kiev. So there's Monastyrska. This is how she takes her curtain call. There's the Ukrainian flag wrapped around Princess Turandot. And she was quoted after the performance as saying, I wanted to help however I could. I think about my parents, my son, and my brother, who are all in Ukraine, every minute and every second. So, we have this kind of split screen between these two opera stars, both with flags, and it's pretty obvious which one has the moral high ground here. It's not Netrebko. So, the end result of this is that Netrebko is canceled, expelled until at least 2024 by the Met, and at least temporarily by other opera companies, including the Bavarian State Opera and the Berlin State Opera, both in Germany. The aforementioned conductor, who's a brilliant conductor, especially of Russian repertoire, Valery Gergiev, was expelled indefinitely by the Met and by the Royal Swedish Academy of Music, permanently by the Munich Philharmonic, where he was music director, and at least temporarily by Carnegie Hall, which refused to host him, the Vienna Philharmonic, the Rotterdam Philharmonic, and La Scala in Milan. But the story continues. It turns out that an independent arbitrator found that the Met did not have the right to terminate Netrebko for the reasons that it gave. And they had to pay up $200,000 in compensation to her. She was also forced by the arbitrator to cough up $30,000 for saying some of the vicious things she said on social media about her critics at the time. This just happened this past March 2023. And even more recently, as you can see in this Washington Post story, on August 4th, Netrebko and the Metropolitan Opera and general manager Peter Gelb are being sued. She is alleging discrimination when the Met dropped her after Russia invaded Ukraine. And it's alleging that it's discrimination on the basis of national origin, breach of contract, and defamation. So she's asking for $360,000 in damages, citing lost performance and rehearsal fees. And that was just last month, this development showed up. Okay, so let's just talk about what's going on at the Met, and then I'll wrap up my comments. So meanwhile, what's going on at the Met? Well, back in April of 2022, the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra is organized and gives an excellent set of performances while on tour in the summer of 2022. That's the summer immediately following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, Carrie Lynn Wilson, the wife of Peter Gelb of the Met, is the conductor of this orchestra. And more recently, at the end of the summer, President Vladimir Zelensky decorated Gelb and with the Order of Merit, 3rd degree, which is a very high honor, for his support of Ukraine. And I've listed some other kind of celebrity recipients who also were noteworthy in their vocal support for Ukraine, to give you some sense of the company that Peter Gelb is in. And then finally, most recently, this just was an article that came out last week. The Met is continuing to press in its advocacy of the Ukrainian cause by commissioning an opera about the children who have been abducted by Russians during the conflict. I assume most of you have heard about this practice. And at the moment, this Maxim Kolomiets, who's a young up-and-coming Ukrainian composer, is going to be creating an opera based on that topic. So, just to wrap up, what about poor Anna Netrebko? What are her prospects? Where does this leave her? Is her career finished? Well, yesterday I looked at her schedule on her website. In September 2022, just to say what happened last year, she did debut the season at the Vienna State Opera. And remember, she lives in Vienna, she's very popular there. She was singing the lead role of Aida in Verdi's opera. That was a year ago, but that was one of the only gigs she could get. This season, which is just underway, she has upcoming opera and recital dates at major venues with top companies in Berlin, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Paris, Naples, Vienna, La Scala, and quite a few others. So, she's doing all right. I'll leave it at that. If there are questions or comments, we can talk about that during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hodge, for the update on the Anna Netrebko news. Our second presentation today is by our guest, Valerie Sperling. She is Professor of Political Science at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her research interests lie mainly at the intersection of Russian politics and gender studies. She is the author of Organizing Women in Contemporary Russia. The book came out in year 2000. And also Altered States, the Globalization of Accountability. The book came out in 2009. And the award-winning Sex, Politics, and Putin, Political Legitimacy in Russia, 2015. Her most recent book, co-authored with her Clark colleague Robert Poltrite, is Trumping Politics as Usual, Masculinity, Misogyny, and the 2016 Elections. The book came out in the year 2020. So, Valerie Sperling.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to open up. There we go. Start I have a Mac. I'm a Mac person. So first I just want to thank Professor Tumarkin for inviting me to join you tonight to talk about Russia now. What I'm going to focus on this evening is what's sometimes called the conservative turn in Russian domestic politics under Putin and how it's related to Russia's war against Ukraine. So I'll leave the discussion of the war to Professor Tumarkin and perhaps to the Q&A as well. And what I'll talk about is how what we're seeing in Russia these days is an increasingly conservative, patriarchal, homophobic, and transphobic rhetoric coming out of Putin's government, as well as laws and policies on reproductive rights, on LGBTQ or queer rights, and how that rhetoric is being used also by Putin's government to justify the war against Ukraine. So I want to start by noting that it really wasn't until recently that Putin began saying explicitly patriarchal, homophobic, and especially transphobic things in his public speeches. Legitimacy is always something that we have to talk about when we think about politics. And for Putin, it's been in part about masculinity and toughness, making Russia great again, asserting Russia's power, including military power in the world. But for all the propaganda about Putin's masculinity and the Kremlin's image campaign, where Putin's strength has been identified with Russia's strength, as you can see in this campaign billboard from 2018, despite all that, Putin didn't say a whole lot against gender equality or LGBTQ rights until quite recently, until about 6 months before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So let me say a bit about where this conservative turn came from, this turn toward gender traditionalism in Russia, and when it got started. So as you might know, or you might remember, Putin's third term as president started in 2012, following a series of widespread popular protests against electoral fraud in Russia's December 2011 parliamentary elections. Seeing so many people in the streets of Moscow and other places, the regime was concerned that that Putin had lost the support of the educated, professional, middle class. And thus Putin shifted to the right to try and capture a different audience with more conservative leanings. So you could see this conservative turn in a series of policies that attacked women's rights and LGBTQ rights, and also in this anti-Western, anti-American political rhetoric that criticized the US and the EU for embracing those kinds of rights and for trying to spread those ideas in Russia to try to undermine the Russian state through, feminism and gay rights. So gender and sexuality were really central to this conservative turn. Women's rights in Russia were rolled back in several areas. In 2011, for instance, despite protests, the regime restricted abortion rights. It established a waiting period for abortion on demand, which was then and still is actually available up until 12 weeks of pregnancy. They limited the reasons for second trimester abortion to rape and medical issues only, and they introduced mandatory consultation with a psychologist as part of any visit to an abortion clinic. And in general, they put a new emphasis on fixing Russia's so-called demographic problem, a low birth rate that the government wanted to increase, and did so, or tried to do so, by offering money to women who had more than one child. This is called the Maternity Capital Program that actually started a little earlier in 2006. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February of 2022, we saw further restrictions on abortion, with at least one region in Russia so far banning what they call the incitement to abortion. In other words, in Mordovia, which is a Russian region about 500 kilometers east of Moscow, as of August this year, it's illegal to encourage a woman to have an abortion. The regime's efforts to promote the idea of women needing to have more children was also continued with Putin signing a new policy very recently that brings back what was a Soviet-era award, the Soviet-era Mother Heroine Award, which gives women a special monetary bonus of $16,000 and this national level recognition if they give birth to 10 children that get at least to the age of 1 year old and who all live in Russia. LGBTQ rights in Russia have also suffered under this conservative turn. A federal law passed in 2013 banned, as Professor Hodge said, promoting, quote, non-traditional sexual relations to minors. So this is often referred to as the gay propaganda ban. So what this meant in reality was that same-sex relations or same-sex relationships were not allowed to be presented in a positive light or as equivalent in value to heterosexual relationships in front of children. So you couldn't talk about gayness in any kind of a positive way if there were children around, people under 18. Since 2013, there have been a lot of prosecutions under that law. as well as an increase in vigilante violence against people assumed to be or thought to be gay by homophobic groups. And there was also a violent state-sponsored campaign in Chechnya a handful of years ago. And in 2020, a constitutional amendment was passed in Russia that defines marriage exclusively as being between a man and a woman. And as you might predict, based on what I have said already, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, these homophobic policies became even more restrictive. So, for example, in November of 2022, that gay propaganda ban from 2013 was expanded to ban any positive or neutral mention of LGBTQ topics in front of audiences of any age, so not just children, which led to things like charges against book publishers that covered those topics, and it could be used to prosecute people just for being queer in public. And earlier this year, Russia's parliament passed a law banning gender affirmation surgery for trans people, and also making it illegal for trans people to change their gender on their official identification documents, and also to adopt children. And the government can even now annul marriages that take place between people who had changed their gender officially even before their marriage. Some of the comments made by Russian parliamentarians around this law are indicative of the kind of conservative and transphobic attitudes that the regime is promoting these days. So, for example, one member of parliament said, quote, "The Western transgender industry is trying to penetrate our nation, creating a window for their multi-billion-dollar business," and based on that, it was necessary to ban gender affirmation surgery to prevent a wave of Russian men changing their gender to avoid military service in Ukraine. I want to point out that these efforts to kind of re-legitimate the regime on this more conservative basis were not far out of step with Russian public opinion. So a nationwide survey that was done in Russia in the spring of 2021 included some good news about gender relations in that it found the population was nearly unanimous in thinking that a husband hitting his wife or girlfriend could not be justified, which suggests that although there's currently no law against domestic violence in Russia, there would be popular support for a law specifically criminalizing domestic violence. And Russia's population also leans, as you can see, toward gender equality on the question of whether divorce can be considered justifiable, as well as on women having an equal right to work when jobs are scarce. On abortion, the population was evenly split on whether it could be justified, and so that kind of reflects, it makes those laws around abortion restriction a little more comprehensible. But in line with the increasingly homophobic and transphobic policies in Russia, Russian public opinion on LGBTQ rights was much less tolerant, with 69% of the adults surveyed saying they would not want, quote unquote, sexual minorities as neighbors, and 89% saying marriage should only be between a man and a woman. One thing to keep in mind is that these differences are probably legacies of the Soviet era, during which the government rhetorically supported women's equality and made abortion available, except for like a 20-year period under Stalin mostly, but criminalized gay male sex completely from 1933 onward. All right, now I just want to connect this conservative turn in Russian domestic policy more explicitly to the regime's justification of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we can see that in looking at some of Putin's statements through a gender lens. And if we do that, it's obvious that in the months preceding the invasion, that Putin's public language became increasingly homophobic and transphobic and anti-Western. It's true that for years, really since Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine in 2014, that the West, meaning Europe and the United States, had been painted by Russian conservatives as places where feminism and women's rights and gay rights were ruining society morally. That was how those parts of the world were talked about, while Russia, by contrast, was praised by conservatives as a place where traditional conservative values prevailed. But with few exceptions, Putin's major speeches in his first 20 years of power, so from 2000 to 2020, included nothing explicitly opposed to gender equality, and really only a couple of homophobic remarks, and I can talk more about those in the Q&A if you want. But as the full-scale invasion of Ukraine got closer, Putin's gender conservative rhetoric, especially opposing LGBTQ rights, escalated. So for instance, in his October 2021 speech to the Valdai Club's annual meeting, and that's mostly aimed at political and business elites in Russia and some foreigners, Putin made strikingly more conservative and extensive comments on gender roles and identities than he ever had before. He attacked what he called Western norms on these issues, saying in part, "We look in amazement at the processes underway in Western countries. The demand to give up the traditional notions of mother, father, family, and even gender." And he also made, for the first time, explicitly transphobic comments, saying it was truly monstrous when women are taught from an early age that a boy can easily become a girl and vice versa. And he added, and I quote, that this verges on a crime against humanity. 2 months later, at his annual big press conference that he gives most of the time in December, and this is December 2021, Putin said, quote, "I uphold the traditional approach that a woman is a woman, a man is a man, a mother is a mother, and a father is a father." So this is a rather strikingly strong endorsement of traditional values on gender identity. And then 2 months after that, we saw Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And this emphasis on traditional values was part of Putin's justification for the invasion, as we can see in his lengthy diatribe on February 24th of 2022, when he stated, and I quote, "They," meaning the West, "sought to destroy our traditional values and force on us their false values that would erode us, our people, from within. The attitudes they've been aggressively imposing on their countries, attitudes that are directly leading to degradation and degeneration because they are contrary to human nature. This is not going to happen." So there, in his reference to traditional values, he's clearly alluding to the LGBTQ community and to LGBT rights. And these kinds of declarations continued following the invasion. So in March of 2022, Putin's ally at the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, he proclaimed in a sermon that gay pride parades were a loyalty test demanded by the West, one that the separatists in Ukraine's Donbass had, quote, "fundamentally rejected." The Patriarch further justified Russia's so-called special military operation as a necessity to prevent the influx of socially liberal Western values, including gay rights. And what Kirill said about that was, "If humanity accepts that sin is a variation of human behavior, then human civilization will end there." Then, at the end of September last year, in Putin's speech at the ceremony for Russia's illegal annexation of the Ukrainian regions of Luhansk and Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporizhia, Putin felt it necessary to build again on this ultra-conservative, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric to help justify the annexation. So he said, in part, quote, "Do we want to have here, in our country, in Russia, parent number 1, parent number 2, and parent number 3, and then he added this parenthetical, they have completely lost it over there, instead of mother and father. Do we want our schools to impose on our children from their earliest days in school perversions that lead to degradation and extinction? Do we want to drum into their heads the idea that certain other genders exist alongside women and men, and to offer them gender reassignment surgery? Is that what we want for our country and our children? This is all unacceptable to us." So, it's notable that he's going out of his way to talk about this in the context of illegally annexing parts of southern Ukraine. And then finally, at the Valdai Club in October of 2022, Putin reiterated this generally LGBTQ-phobic rhetoric, saying, "If the Western elites believe that they can have their people and their societies embrace what I believe are strange and trendy ideas, like dozens of genders or gay pride parades, so be it. Let them do as they please, but they certainly have no right to tell others to follow in their footsteps." So when we think about domestic politics in Russia now, we can look back and see that Putin was using this language of conservative traditional values, especially with regard to gender identity, to justify the war, to justify the invasion of Ukraine, and that he was signaling this specifically with an uptick in his LGBTQ-phobic language in the months before the invasion. So using that gender lens helps shed light at least on the justification of the invasion of Ukraine to Putin's domestic audience, playing on these pre-existing homophobic and transphobic sentiments among Russia's population as a way to try to get support for the war. I do want to note in closing that there have been protests in Russia against the war and against the conservative turn, but that the Russian government's harsh suppression of public protest has moved most of it online, and I can talk about that in the Q&A as well. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Valerie. Our last presentation is by Nina Tumarkin, Catherine Wasserman-Davis Professor of Slavic Studies. She offers courses covering over 1,000 years of Russian history and culture, including a first-year seminar on Vladimir Putin that she will offer next spring, next semester, in spring of 2024. Professor Tumarkin is the author of 2 books, Lenin Lives, The Lenin Cult in Soviet Russia, and The Living and the Dead, The Rise and the Fall of the Cult of World War II in Russia. Her current book project concerns the memory of World War II in today's Russia. Professor Tumarkin, welcome.
Well, I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening. A special welcome to Valerie Sperling, our guest, who has before appeared on this panel in the not-too-distant past. This is Russia Now. I'm an historian, so I spend most of my time talking about Russia then. But not only because, as Dr. Epsteyn mentioned, I do offer a course on first-year seminar on Putin, so any first-year students here, I really encourage you to take it, and we read Sex, Politics, and Putin by Valerie Sperling. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. So I'm going to start out by talking, of course, about the Russo-Ukrainian War. A note, you probably know this, that even after almost 18 months since the February 24th, 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's forbidden in Russia to publicly use the word war in reference to it. It is referred to as a special military operation. Why this is the case even now, it's pretty straightforward. In Russia, the Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II. War is a very scary word, a very frightening word. And the Kremlin seeks to minimize the nature and the scope of the military conflict while maximizing the threat posed by the enemy. This war is slogging on relentlessly, slowly, with no sign of a possible end. The number of Russian military war dead number between 32,000 for sure, and going perhaps as high as 60,000. There's one reliable source for this. There's a BBC statistical site called Mediazone, where they actually count individuals, and this is what they say, that the numbers for sure are 32,000 Russian military war dead, but it could be twice that number. Ukraine's counteroffensive, launched in June, is making only the slowest progress. The war is bogged down, inching along village by village. There's an article in today's New York Times saying that it's moving sometimes only a few yards at a time. Russia itself cannot launch a major offensive. It's not in a position to do that. And actually, if you want to compare a previous wartime situation, it's looking like World War I, with the bogged down of the trenches of stalemate. What are the Kremlin's goals? Well, to annex the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine with Donetsk and Luhansk, and other areas that Russia has occupied, thus splitting the country and weakening it profoundly, to occupy the whole country. The goals have kept shifting. Originally, the Kremlin's goal was regime change. The idea that they would go in, take Kiev within a few days, and have a change of regime as what happened as the events in Czechoslovakia in 1968, with very little bloodshed. In fact, when the first incursion into Kiev, officers were sent with their dress uniforms so they could march in the victory parade. It is not what happened. But when the Kremlin talked about denazification, they meant regime change. They claimed that the Kiev regime is full of Nazis, headed by President Zelensky, a Nazi. He's a Jew, so it's more than a little preposterous. And the claim to be fighting Nazis is still an important part of the Kremlin's rhetoric. Nazis, they call them nationalists, as though you have to be, if you are a nationalist for your own country, you're some kind of fascist. There is an absolute conflation between the special military operation and World War II, or as they call it, the Great Patriotic War. We liberated Ukraine from the fascists in 1944 and 45. We're doing it again because they're fascists and we have to cleanse Europe of fascism. Recently, President Putin stated, and you might have seen this, that Volodymyr Zelensky's, quote, Western masters had placed him, an ethnic Jew, as Putin called him, into the presidency to hide his true nature as a fascist, adding that Putin said that his own Jewish friends say that Zelensky is a disgrace to the Jewish people. Well, this is very unusual for Putin. He has not had a history of being anti-Semitic. If anything, he was philo-Semitic. And some of his best friends are Jews, not only among the oligarchs now, but his childhood friends, the Rottenberg brothers, and so many others. This is, I think it's not, it really wasn't meant to be anti-Semitic as much as he'll say anything that he can say that's negative about Zelensky, anything to discredit Zelensky. This conflation of World War II, constant imagery about it, it was very telling that I think it was August 23rd, the day that the airplane with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who had staged this mutiny in June, the day that the plane crashed near the city of Tver, Putin was in the city of Kursk, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the great tank battle of the summer of 1943, and praising the armed forces and praising the Russian people for it. Putin and his people, especially former President Dmitry Medvedev, who's a real hardliner, assert that the United States is engaging in a proxy war in Ukraine with the aim of destroying Russia. The real enemy is the West, and especially the USA. This view of the US hostility to Russia, not just hostility, but the desire to weaken and destroy the country, very much predates it. I myself remember in 2018 talking with a very ordinary school teacher who told me what a relief it was that the American president was, well, the 45th president. And that had Hillary Clinton as president been elected as president, she for sure would have launched a war against Russia, maybe even nuclear war. I mean, he said everybody in Russia knows that. What are the Russian perceptions of the war right now? The general line of those who support the war is, we cannot lose this war. We simply cannot lose this war, or we cannot afford to lose this war, because There's an existential threat from the West, and our survival is at stake. We are a great country that wins all its wars, which is completely untrue, for example. Think of the Afghanistan war, for example. And on September 1st, just early this month, official school starts everywhere in Russia on September 1st, and Putin made a speech to school children in which he said, "I understood why we won the great patriotic war. It is impossible to defeat this kind of nation with this kind of attitude. We were absolutely invincible, and we are the same now. Absolutely invincible." In Russia, there's one reliable polling agency, the Levada polling agency in Moscow. It's really very good, even though all poll figures right now have to be suspect because people are more afraid than they used to be of saying what they really think. So there was a poll September 12th, which is very recent, in which people were asked to name the countries that they would call great countries. In 2002, 43% of respondents to this question said that Russia was a great country. 62% said that the USA was a great country. Fast forward to 2023, 80% said that Russia is a great country, and only 32% said that the USA is a great country. You see how the perception of Russia has changed from 2002 to 2023, due to propaganda, due to events such as the Sochi Olympics, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the 2018 World Cup, the elevated and inflated propaganda that's come out of this current war. It's hard to say how long the war will drag on. For Putin, being the leader of a defeated nation is utterly inconceivable. It's just impossible. Zelensky doesn't want to relinquish any territory. Neither side wants to negotiate peace. The war could go on for years. The outcome, I hate to say it, will in part be determined by the United States 2024 presidential election. If the 45th president gets reelected and US military support to Ukraine is cut back substantially, it's unclear whether Europe could provide sufficient support to Ukraine to prevent a Russian victory. And it's clear that Ukraine has little chance of survival without significant external aid. Frankly, in the long run, it's not a popular view, but I don't see how Ukraine can prevail against Russia. With its huge military force, its functioning economy, undamaged infrastructure, Ukraine has none of these things. The Western sanctions, how are they affecting life in Russia? You'd never know there were sanctions. The sanctions and even the war are hardly felt, particularly in the major cities like Moscow. Restaurants are packed, theaters are packed, stores are full of imported goods, mostly coming now from Morocco, from Turkey, from the Middle East. Many people have been receiving financial gains from the war. Military salaries are very high. The military-industrial complex, war-related industries are extremely well paid. All of this is coming out of state coffers. Russia has a lot of money. And many people have fled the country. I'm thinking in part also of people like me, academics, the cultural elite. They're leaving vacancies and opportunities for other people who now have their jobs, their positions. The perceptions of the war on the part of people. What do they think? Well, I get the impression that many people just don't want to know about it. They want to go on with their normal lives. They crave normalcy. The most recent Nevada poll at the end of August 2023 asking people about the extent to which they're following the what they say, following the news surrounding the Ukraine situation. What can they say, right? Are they paying a great deal of attention or little attention to it? And the answer is that over 50% aren't following the news at all, or are paying very little attention to it. Only 17% of the respondents said that they were very attentively following the news of what's happening in Ukraine. Among people 55 and older, many do. 63% follow the war, 25% of them very attentively. Among people your age, students, so 18 to 24 years, only 2% say they're following it attentively. Another 25% somewhat attentively. 70% say they support the special military operation, either strongly or somewhat, with men much more supportive than women. And Moscow residents much less supportive than people in the rural areas or small towns. The government knows that people are clinging to normalcy. And that's why they fear far-right hardliners as much as anti-war liberals. They want a passive support from the populace. And for this reason also, Putin is very reluctant to call a mass mobilization, even though they need more troops. The only mobilization that they called up was a year ago, in September 2022, and it was very destabilizing. Somewhere between 200 and 400,000 men fled the country within 3 or 4 weeks of the mobilization to avoid the draft. If there's another mobilization, anybody between the ages of 18 and 30, any men, not women, could be drafted, and the Kremlin fears a backlash. So it has to rely on contract soldiers who volunteer to serve for a year, but they're lured into service by very high pay and privileges. Putin has just this year ordered a 10% quota for veterans from the veterans of the special military operation and their children to enter universities free of having to take entrance exams. Because in the summer they took entrance exams and most of them failed. So now they waived it and they're all admitted. This is one of the many privileges. There's successful recruitment from volunteers among the poor, among the non-Russian nationalities. They're not recruiting people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, but from small areas in Siberia, the non-Buryatia, the non-Russian people. Many people really do believe that there is this existential threat. Many people are living better than they had before the war. They take pride in the idea that Russia is a great nation, doing great deeds. Older people get their news mostly from television, and of course all of television is state-run. Younger people, more from the internet and social media. The television shows very little of what's going on in the war, and talks mostly about, if they're going to talk about it, they talk about various successes. But there are other efforts. There are propaganda efforts that are really very successful and very extreme. Patriotic education in the schools. All children are required to take patriotic education courses. There's a new course compulsory in all universities across Russia called the Foundations of Russian Statehood, in which Russian students, and every first-year student has to be able to take it with expected learning outcomes and objectives to learn about the greatness of Russian civilization, to learn about our culture, to learn to love and be responsible, and the creation and development and value orientations of the Russian civilization, ideological doctrines. There are all these learning goals that are not the kinds of things that we have in the history department here at Wellesley. There's a new Russian history textbook for the older high school students in grades 10 and 11. There are only 11 grades. And it portrays Russian history after 1945 as having the Soviet Union as a great and special power betrayed by all those that it helped, like Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics, under constant assault by the West and its collaborators inside Russia. Ukraine haunts this textbook, talking about collaborators in Ukraine during World War II, saying that Ukrainian nationalism was responsible for high crime rates in the 1940s. I mean, it's just vilifying Ukraine. And there are many people, of course, who oppose this war. Just some words about them. That brave Alexei Navalny, who's been in prison now for years already, after his arrest in 2020, has been very, of course, outspoken, and his term was now increased by an additional 19 years. I mean, they're trying to murder him, obviously. It's slow murder in the penal colony. But others, Karamurza, a great film figure, and other important critics of the war, have been getting Stalinist type terms, 25 years. This is unheard of. But we shouldn't go and say Putin has brought the Stalin-era back, because it's not true at all. There's nothing like mass incarceration. We're talking about hundreds of people being arrested, not thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, or millions. Some people are comparing Putin to Stalin, and perhaps Putin thinks that maybe with this war, there'll be a victory and he'll be like Stalin. Stalin did so many horrible things, but he's viewed positively because he was victorious in the war. And maybe Putin thinks that his legacy, after he's gone even, will be that he was the great victor in this war. I mean, who knows? It's really very crazy. So how has the war affected Putin, his regime? I know I have to wind up. His approval rating remains high, but he's definitely been weakened. They've had no real successes militarily since the seizure of Bakhmut in May, which was done really by the Wagner forces, headed by this Yevgeny Prigozhin. Ukraine has been attacking Russian sites with drones, even in Moscow. And most shocking, the mutiny of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner private military company, carried out this open rebellion in June, racing towards Moscow, seizing the city of Rostov-on-Don, shooting down Russian aircraft, killing Russian pilots. And of course, the death of Prigozhin, which happened in the plane crash in August, was a foregone conclusion. They couldn't risk a trial. I mean, in a trial, Prigozhin could speak and defend himself. And he was very popular. Admirers appreciated the spirit of criminality and the ruthless force that he emanated. He was in tune with the core beliefs of a very significant minority. In fact, shortly before his march on Moscow, 19% of respondents in the Levada poll were ready to vote for him as president. And he was the 5th most trusted public figure after President Putin, Prime Minister Mishustin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and Defense Minister Shoigu. This was not an attempted coup. Prigozhin was being pushed out and controlled by the Ministry of Defense. The so-called rebellion was really a stupid act of desperation. He saw his whole huge empire, his business structure, his holdings in Africa, very, very rich man. He saw it all coming to an end, and it was an act of desperation. He paid for it with his own life. What is to come? Of course, no one knows. In Russia, there's been a pattern that defeat in war has led to reform or revolution. The defeat in the Crimean War led to the reforms, the emancipation of the serfs in the middle of the 19th century. The defeat in the Russo-Japanese War led to the revolution of 1905. The actual defeat, really, in World War I led to the Russian Revolution. Also, you could say there's a pattern of reform after very harsh rule. After the terribly harsh rule of Nicholas I came Alexander II and his reforms. After Stalin came Nikita Khrushchev and the thaw. After Brezhnev came Gorbachev and Yeltsin. So perhaps after Putin, there might be a thaw. Let's hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tumarkin. Thank you for concluding your talk with on a very hopeful note. And on this note, I'm opening the floor to questions. I think we have somebody with microphones who'll be floating around the room and offering you a chance to speak up. Okay, I'll get started. I'll start with, I'll ask a question that is relevant to what I started with. Vladimir Zelensky, Ukrainian president, is in the United States right now as we speak. He is in New York City participating in the United Nations. General, it's not a General Assembly, it's a Security Council, exactly, yeah. So what are your expectations? What is your estimate? What are your expectations in terms of the results of Zelensky's second visit in the United States? And just in general, what do you think? Is the United States doing enough to help Ukraine? What else can be done by this wonderful country to help Ukraine, win the war and bring the end to this war as soon as possible?
Right. Well, Zelensky spoke very, very well, and President Biden spoke very well. I was just concerned that there were, many people were absent. The president of China was absent. The president of India was absent. I think that what Zelensky is trying to do is combat Ukraine war fatigue. And he was, I think, very smart to come and speak, and it was very compelling. It won't be surprising that I think that America should do everything that we can. We can't get involved in an actual war. I mean, it would be a disaster. We would bring the rest of NATO along with us. So it would really be World War III. But whatever we can do, I know that there are these particular Kazooie tanks that were promised already some months back that apparently will be sent soon. So yes, I actually read. I didn't watch the speeches, but I read both speeches, and I thought they were very compelling. And I'm so upset and so scared about what's going to happen with our election in case another president who does re-elect think like I do would withhold aid, because Ukraine really won't be able to survive without it. Yes, Dr. Moore.
So bodies are indispensable. So it's discouraging to hear that there's plenty of money and goods in the cities, but if he does, eventually he has to replenish his soldiers on the field, does he not? And will that lead to another evacuation, voluntary evacuation of bodies?
You mean if there's another mobilization and
Yes.
people want to
Yeah.
flee, they could always close the borders. I mean, Ukraine did, I mean, Ukrainian men aren't allowed to leave the country if they're of military age.
So that we can't look
Well, I
forward
mean,
to
the
that.
government, the regime is just tightening the screws and just getting more, more and more repressive. Valerie, you agree with me there? Yeah. So, but they have a huge population. And, because of oil revenues, they just have a lot of reserves. I mean, I've just been reading so many articles, and people are saying, well, my son decided he wants to go. I mean, he's got so many debts. How is he going to pay off his debts? He's going to go to the military, right? And then they also promise big rewards. If somebody's wounded or killed, then the families get very big recompense. So sometimes, parents are actually pressuring their children to go. It's all fine. It's all the money.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I would add, is this on as well? Okay. You know, something that I think about when we talk about recruitment into the military, you know, who's signing up, you know, and why, even independent of a mobilization and a draft. The ads that you can see in Russia for military recruitment play enormously on masculinity, like literally explicitly on masculinity. You know, like they'll show a guy who's working as a security guard in a, you know, in a grocery store, and then they'll show him like in full military gear with, you know, the you know, semi-automatic rifle, and it's like, is that the kind of man you want to be, or is this the kind of man you want to be? It's really incredibly stark the way that they're using masculinity, and I think that that certainly helps recruit as well. The other thing that comes to mind for me around the United Nations is, as probably many of you know, there are a lot of formerly colonized countries that are not on Ukraine's team in this war, you know, that are much more on Russia's side. And I think one of Zelensky's struggles is to successfully paint Russia as what it is, which is an imperialist state. For Ukraine, you know, wanting to be part of Western Europe and saying all the time, we're European, we want to be part of Western Europe, I don't think that resonates so well for states that were colonized by Western European countries. And so there's this belief, right, that the enemy of, you know, of our enemy is our friend, so that therefore Russia must be good and not imperialist. But Russia's extremely, you know, as we can see right now in these efforts to, you know, take over Ukraine. Russia was imperialist as an empire and then as the Soviet Union. And so anyway, I think that's one of the struggles that Zelensky is facing internationally.
Well, the way he's been talking about it, though, and actually he talked about it today, is remember these countries, the global south, the countries in Africa, rely on Ukrainian exports of grain. And so Russia is preventing those exports. So that's what he's focusing on, and that's just the way to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Please go ahead.
What kinds of future possibilities are Ukrainians facing, like, regarding like the results like of the war? Like, if Russia wins or loses, like, what's gonna happen to Ukraine politically and also economically? Are they gonna, like, is like post-revolution, before like they suffered from the famine of the Stalin's 5-year plan? I was wondering, like, after this one, are they gonna still keep struggling with the outcome of the war?
They
Regardless of
have to. It's going to be terrible. I mean, Professor Hodge was talking about Mariupol getting pulverized. I mean, so many areas are just destroyed. So it's, I mean, there was a conversation that I read about in a Russian article where somebody said, Papa, what are we going to do when the war is over? And the father says, we're going to first of all apologize to the Ukrainian people for everything that we did, and then we're going to do everything we can to begin to rebuild the country. Well, I mean, this is one person, you know, speaking to his child, but it's, I mean, Ukraine has been through such terrible ordeals. I would say, and I'm looking at Haley Sweeney, who wrote a brilliant senior thesis on the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor. And this doesn't compare to the Holodomor in terms of, I mean, those were, we're talking about 4 million people, you know, died. But you didn't have the destruction of cities, and so it's going to be a terrible thing. And so then Ukraine's going to need so much, there's going to have to be some kind of Marshall Plan to help rebuild it. But of course, we don't know what it's going to be like. Is it going to still exist as a country? Is it going to be annexed by Russia? Who knows? It's a story, the symphony plays out in a minor key, put it that way.
I believe I remember reading in the beginning of the war that obviously Ukraine wished to be part of the European Union and applied to be part of the European Union, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think also NATO, that they wish to be part of NATO. What is the actuality of that actually occurring under the current circumstances, because I know that a lot of European Union and also NATO members are very on the offense of that happening because they would have to be included in the war.
Do you want to answer that? I'll start. Well, I think that, first of all, no country can become a member of NATO if it's actively involved in any kind of military conflict. And so one of the reasons I think that the Russians were so keen on this simmering war in the Donbass that went on for 8 years starting in 2014 was that it made Ukraine absolutely ineligible to join NATO. Ukraine wanted to, there was a question of Ukraine joining the European Union, just getting some sort of associate membership, just some connection. And it was the Ukrainian president was actually about to sign it in 2013 when, under huge pressure from Putin, he changed his mind and wouldn't sign it, and that started the whole Ukrainian revolution in November of 2013 that then continued into 2014. So that all blew up. All of that's, distant. I mean, it's so ironic that Putin says, one of the reasons was that they went into Ukraine was because they're fearing the expansion of NATO. And now you've got Sweden and Finland and Sweden and soon Finland joining NATO. So NATO expanded. He's certainly not getting his goals met.
Okay, you go ahead. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth row, please. Go ahead. Masha, you're next.
Professor, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I actually do have a question regarding the singer, the opera singer. Yeah, so I admit that we should definitely condemn her morally for sure for her social media posts and also the bad record. But I'm just pondering what other choices she had at that time. As an opera artist who was officially endorsed by Putin, can or could she even stand up publicly against this war? Or should she just stay silent?
Will you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. What choices did Anna Netrebko have when she was, when she found herself in the position that she was in? And I agree. It was not straightforward. She had received tremendous early support early in her career from that conductor I mentioned, Valery Gergiev, in St. Petersburg, at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where Gergiev rules the Mariinsky Theater and also the conservatory. That's where she studied, that's where she was discovered. Petersburg is also Putin's town, and Putin and Gergiev go way back. And so the early support she received put her in a position of sort of being beholden to the conservatory and to Gergiev, and Gergiev is a friend of Putin's. And I think, it's a very difficult case to figure out exactly and satisfactorily. I think that she, as I began to point out, she was raised in a very conservative family. She's not a Ukrainian Cossack, she's a Russian Cossack. And if you look at the way Cossacks now are reacting to the war in Ukraine, the tendency is for Ukrainian Cossacks to be pro-Ukraine, the Russian Cossacks are pro-Russia. She's from the Russian side, even though it's close by. So I think she was raised with a lot of these same conservative values and probably similar ideas about gender roles. She's been overheard making Ukrainian ethnic slurs kind of off the record at protesters who kind of have surrounded her and heckled her starting in 2014, have allegedly heard her say things that are sort of anti-Ukrainian. So I think she's kind of a conservative, I don't know how to put it, a little bit of a redneck herself, kind of just by the way she was brought up and the way she thinks. And I think she is put in this position of owing a debt to her benefactors. So what could she have done? She would have had to have a great deal of foresight and a really firm moral spine very early on to say, thank you, Mr. President, but I don't think I want to be the people's artist of the Russian Federation. She didn't do that. I don't know how many of us would have done that because we wouldn't have been able to see farther ahead. I do condemn her later for when she had her very rich and well-heeled Western life all set up, and she was in a much stronger position to be able to raise her voice against what she was seeing, and she really didn't do it until it was too late, and she'd sort of, let her career slip away. So she's a complicated case. She has not been banned, as far as I know, by the Ukrainians. She is not on the lists that I've been able to find of the Zelensky government's Russians who are not welcome in Ukraine. So she, unlike people like the director Nikita Mikhalkov or Valerie Sperling, they are. She's just been more wishy-washy than she should have been, I think, in the later stages of her life. Yeah.
Well, before she went bad, Professor Hodge was in love with her.
I was hoping you would not bring that up.
Well, you should have seen him when we went to the recital. We went to a recital. We also saw her in Eugenia Onegin. Yeah.
She's a spectacular singer.
Okay, Masha.
Yeah, Professor Sperling, I was really interested when you were talking about like specifically abortion laws and how that kind of matches onto like cultural response and like social response to different things, like the social response to increase like anti-gay legislation has been very positive because that's been kind of the social trend around that, like since the Soviet era. Has there been more obvious pushback against changes kind of in terms of like the idea of like women's sphere, like women staying within their sphere because of Soviet era, like at least kind of like paying heed to gender equality? Like, are people laughing at the mother heroine thing at all, or are they absorbing it kind of willingly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know with regard to the mother heroine thing how seriously anybody takes it. I mean, who has 10 children? I mean, it's just not something that happens every day. What I think the regime tried to do in a more, measured sense was this maternity capital policy in 2006, and this offers, basically a lump sum of money to women. Interestingly, not to the family, but to women specifically, because they know that if they offer it to the family and the men get their hands on it, they're going to just drink it, right? And so they offer it to women, and you can only use it for certain things. You can use it to improve your housing, you can use it for your kids' education, you can use it toward the woman's pension, because there's this recognition that if she's going to step out of the workforce for some period of time, the maternity capital would help convince her to, to take that step out and maybe to do it twice or 3 times or something like that. But that said, I mean, for all, the Soviet Union's rhetoric, the Communist Party's rhetoric, was very much about gender equality in a certain way. It was all like women can, need to and should work outside the home. And they did a lot towards women's literacy. The literacy rates there were pretty incredible, and labor force participation rates of women were extremely high in the communist world and in Europe. What I think they didn't put a lot of emphasis on was breaking down ideologically the stereotypes about women and the home, or women and children, and really trying to expand the role of men into the parenting sphere. They could have done a lot of ideological work around that, and they didn't do very much. That said, younger people today in Russia believe much more strongly than they did a couple of generations ago in sharing childcare responsibilities and that, and that kind of thing. And in terms of, should women have jobs outside, should women have paid jobs, basically, when men are unemployed? Again, there's an age skew. To that as well. So I can't. There's also a feminist movement in Russia. It's not as powerful as it is in Western Europe or in the United States. I think partly though, and maybe even in large part, that's just because the Putin regime has gotten more and more and more repressive over time. It's now been a whole generation of, of people who've grown up under Putin. And whereas, in the year 2000, it was no problem to organize, a group, and ditto in 2010. By the time you get to 2012, you have this foreign agent law, which has been passed, where at first it was any organization, social organization, that takes money from the West and does political things, totally undefined, what counts as political. Those people could be labeled as foreign agents. Now, it's as vague as if you're under some kind of foreign influence as an individual, you can be labeled as a foreign agent. So that kind of thing really suppresses activism, whether it's feminist activism, whether it's LGBT activism, which also exists, but it's limited. So I'm sure, and I haven't spent time poking around, but I guess I could. I'm sure somewhere on Telegram there are people making fun of the Soviet mother heroine, although they may be more concerned with, that may actually seem frivolous to them to take up right now when the war is going on. So there's that too. It's a great question. Thank you.
I think I'd like to add something, because none of us have yet brought up the increasing influence of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is very traditional in its views. And it's become very powerful, very ideological, in charge of some of the narrative of history. And so this plays also into the conservative turn. And of course, anti-abortion and sort of homophobic, transphobic.
Zina.
So from my perspective, just from the different journalism that I've been, the different media that I've been exposed to and stuff, I'm hearing really mixed signals about kind of the prognosis of this war. On the one hand, I keep seeing photos where people are making fun of, Russian tanks, where it's Soviet tanks and there's literally planks of wood holding it together, and it's artillery from submarines or something, and it's just haha, their army is a complete mess. But then on the other hand, I hear messages like yours that are really negative, or offer a more negative prognosis of, well, Russia has a lot of people and they can just kind of keep refilling people, whereas Ukraine really doesn't have so many quote-unquote disposable lives. And I don't really know what to make sense of all of these mixed signals. On the one hand, I'm are they just trying to make us feel more confident so that we'll keep supporting this war? Or is this actually happening? Or I don't know. So I'm just curious what you'll have to
listen to me, whatever I say. Well, yes, I think it's been a shock to many people how unsuccessful Russian military efforts have been. They threw people in, with almost no training. A lot of them didn't even know where they were going. Then they get there and there's a problem of morale. So many Russians have relatives in Ukraine. Why are we killing Ukrainian brothers? So this is a very special instance. I think if Ukraine had invaded Russia, the Russians would have fought back really well. So it's a question of also morale. And I don't think, I think a lot of their military equipment and materiel is just fine. No, I don't know, Valerie, what do you think?
I think the only thing I would add is that, to the extent that the Russian military underperformed, right, especially at the beginning, there's an enormous, almost unfathomable amount of corruption in Russia, and a lot of the money that was supposed to go to reinforce the capabilities of the Russian military never got there because it went into people's pockets. And in a way, right, what are the long-term constraints on the Russian military? That's one of them. The supply of some things, they're able to get through third parties even because of the sanctions, but I don't know. I don't know that Russian military industrial capacity is infinite. And after a while, I don't know. After a while, you have to imagine that some of the elites are not going to be happy with this ongoing situation, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that let's say you're a Russian oligarch and you don't like these sanctions that are being put on you, and your yacht's been repossessed, or you've been dispossessed of your yacht, and you can't travel the way that you used to. You can imagine, right, that there would be some discontent and some desire for regime change, right, to take out the Putin regime. But removing Prigozhin's plane from the sky is the message, right, that everybody's getting, which is you darn well better have coordinated with absolutely everyone you can think of, including Putin's bodyguards and everybody, before you try to, really take him out. And so it is a little hard to imagine how is that regime change going to take place. And it does sort of seem like it might take something like that to stop Russia's interest in the war. But you never know. I mean, the wonderful thing about Russia's being a dictatorship is that Putin could declare any day victory in Ukraine. We've attacked the country enough, we've attacked the infrastructure enough, and half the time, he's saying the Ukrainians are bombing themselves, so like all we've been doing is, cleaning up inappropriate Nazi-run military installations. Any day he wants to, he can say, we're done here, we're fine. And so that, I think, is a plausible way that we could see the war end, would be if he decides that enough is enough, and I'm going to lose my power if we keep the war going. So that's, I hold out hope. I hold out hope for that.
Yeah, I was just kind of like wondering, and this may be a misconception, but why is like public protests and public uprisings like so seemingly rare in Russia? I think all of you have kind of hinted at some points, but in ex-Soviet states like Ukraine in 2013, 2014, we saw mass uprisings of the people against their government. Why is that like just not a foregone kind of conclusion in Russia?
Well, sure. I mean, there have been mass demonstrations, and I guess it was in your slides, right? You were showing some of those. The problem is the crackdown, as I understand it, in this most recent special operation, as the Russians insist on calling it, is the crackdown has been much more severe. They are throwing everybody in the slammer instantly, and people understand this. I mean, my sense is that the message has gotten out that it's just pointless, that if you go and protest, you're just going to end up in jail, and they're going to throw away the key. So I guess what I'm saying is it's just been a much more severe crackdown this time around than after previous or during previous public protests. I don't know if you guys wanted to add detail to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that, by comparison to Ukraine, say, where there was a much more politically pluralist polity, right, that encourages civil society formation and activism, that really has been missing in Russia kind of the entire time. Probably the freest years, politically speaking, in Russia were when it was still in the Soviet Union in the very late 1980s and early 1990s. There were a couple of years in there where censorship was basically lifted, and there's a lot of enthusiasm. I think Russia, the better comparison is like to the Central Asian states, right? Than to the Western or the Baltic parts of the former Soviet Union.
Emma, and then you go next, and then the person in the back. Okay.
Hello, thank you so much. My question is for Professor Hodge, and I was wondering if you found any other significant precedent from Western art institutions in 2014 or otherwise that might signify the kind of opposition they have now, or if this pushback from the Met and otherwise is new for the invasion in Ukraine.
So just to make sure I understand the question, Emma, are you asking whether similar protest actions by Western arts organizations took place in the wake of the 2024 annexation of Crimea? I'm trying to think back to that time, and there were certainly protests at the Met. I believe the Met, just to name the Met as an example, put out statements against the annexation. I didn't go back and look at that exact question. So I don't have a great answer to give you on that one. I don't. That did not make as much of a stir, certainly, as this war is making right now. I mean, Peter Gelb, the guy who runs the Met, clearly, he just was not willing to tolerate this at all. And it's, I mean, one thing I will say is that it's clear that Netrepka, to use her again as our sort of test case, Netrepka's reaction to the 2014 events had clearly bothered Gelb for a long time, and he was not happy with the way she had handled it, the politics back then. And so he gave her no quarter at all in 2022. He just had no patience left.
Professor Tumarkin, I'm thinking about your expertise in national mythology. How much does Putin sort of use Russian national myths to justify the current expansion into Ukraine? And if so, what are the main myths he uses?
What are the national myths that he uses? He uses history. So he talks about, it's great. He talks about Russian successes. He actually, in 2012, he declared that was the year of Russian history because it was the 200th anniversary of the defeat of Napoleon and the 400th anniversary of the defeat of the Poles during the time of troubles in 1612. And God knows, the 1167th and second anniversary of the founding of Kiev. So he talks about, I mean, it's like Hitler and the 1,000-Year Reich. He talks about the 1,000 years of Russian history, literally, the millennium of the 1,000 years of Russian history. And it goes from victory to victory to success, from success to success, especially military victories that make Russia an exceptional case, a special Russian path. It's not West, it's not Europe. It's better, it's messianic. And it's better, purer than any other. That sounds pretty mythical to me.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
I know that some of the other former Soviet Union countries don't support Ukraine, but besides Belarus, do they support Russia? And then also, what's China's position on this war?
Well, the China thing, the China part is really interesting, of course, because, wouldn't China love to do this kind of thing with Taiwan? And I think that part of what the United States has been signaling with all this support to Ukraine is actually the message to China, which is don't try it, because we're going to take that just as seriously as we're taking this. Sort of similarly to what we were talking about before, with Netrepka and like what choices does she have? The countries in the former Soviet orbit that aren't in the EU, what choice do they have? They've got China and they've got Russia, and so it's a little challenging. Now, Armenia is a really interesting example, right? Armenia is, like, I guess as of today, kind of backing off from its long-standing defense of Nagorno-Karabakh, but up until today, right? Armenia was kind of counting on Russia to back it against this ongoing assault by Azerbaijan and blockade and all that kind of thing. And then within, I don't know, the last few days, Armenia was also kind of reaching out to the United States and doing some collaborative exercises. And, little countries are always in a position to kind of, maybe play the field a little bit. They're going to be very constrained by who their neighbor is. And I think that that's just the case for a lot of these states. So for this summer, I was in Georgia, neighboring country to Russia. And the population is extraordinarily anti-Russian and extremely pro-Ukraine. Everywhere I went, incredible, like propaganda, literally everywhere, in the form of graffiti, right? Like not even propaganda, whatever, grassroots support for Ukraine. Georgian flag next to the Ukrainian flag, next to the NATO flag, next to the EU flag, next to the American flag. The Georgian Dream Party, though, which is in charge of the state, they go to the EU and they talk to the EU and they're like, yeah, we're working on your standards, absolutely. But they know that they're constrained by being Russia's neighbor and they're not really going to be able to do anything anti-Russian. And I think that's, it might be a little different for each of those countries, but I think that's the overall situation.
And of course, those countries have been receiving a lot of emigres from Russia, particularly Armenia and Georgia. They're going to those two places. Well, Kazakhstan too, but I think most prefer to go to Armenia or Georgia if they can. And they're being very, very nicely welcomed. The Armenians are welcoming them. I think the Georgians are having more of a problem. I don't know whether you experienced that, but that's what my Georgian friends have been telling me.
Okay, thank you for waiting.
When the war began, by all accounts, it seemed as if Russia thought this would be a short-term campaign, maybe weeks or months, and now here we are a year and a half later, and it's continuing. And that is obviously a big disconnect that happened, and I'd like to hear the panel's opinion on whether there was a single factor, be it Putin's bravado or the inherent weakness of the military, the undervalued strength of Ukraine, or something else that really is the reason for that disconnect, or whether it's just a perfect storm of a number of factors coming together.
Can I start this one? Well, you have to keep in mind that Putin was absolutely panicked about COVID. And so he kept himself isolated for 2-3 years, hardly seeing anybody. People still have to quarantine for 2 weeks before seeing him. And actually, in fact, it was just as a good little aside, after the Prigozhin mutiny, he was seen in a southern Russian city hugging babies and shaking hands with people, which he never did because he wanted to kind of, restore his strength. It's sort of the idea of his legitimacy as a popular leader. But anyway, he was in a cocoon. I think the disconnect partly was that he was really misinformed. He, I think, expected that a lot of Ukrainians would welcome the Russians with open arms. And people, he's been in power for a quarter of a century, and people tell him what they think he wants to hear. So I think that's part of it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And at the same time, one of the things that just baffled me, and continues, honestly, to this day to baffle me, what was Putin's job, right? He was the head of intelligence. He was the head of an intelligence agency. How does that guy not get on, before you start a major war, how do you not just do a little double check? Like, what if your advisors are stupid, right? Or what if they're misinformed, or they're misinforming you? Like, wouldn't you do like a little extra research first, just to see like, what might the reception be, in Kiev to a Russian invasion? It baffles me to this day. I don't understand that with his background, he would have been so recklessly uninformed. Which is not to say that political leaders all around the world don't do stupid things all the time. They do. But this is like an egregiously stupid thing that also, has brought an enormous amount of just, damage and death to people, including to Russians. So yeah, I agree with what you said. I think it's true. I think he was underinformed. I think he was isolated, but I don't understand how he could have allowed that to,
It's one of history's greatest blunders. A fantastic blunder.
I don't know if this is something that you folks can speak to, but in addition to China's role, I'm curious about the role of India and Modi in general in this. And Professor Sperling, I was really intrigued by your discussion of the way that Russia isn't viewed as an imperial nation to previously colonized nations, particularly with India was the one that came to mind, given Modi's, continued resistance to opposing Russia. And for some reason, the second, I don't know if this is a question, but the parallel between India's space program and Russia's big moon landing disaster was very interesting to me, that those followed a similar timeline with different results. And I was wondering if you could speak to what this means for Indo-Russian relations.
That's interesting. Okay, so I can just say a little bit because I know very little about the India-Russian relationship. Of course, the Soviet Union, I think that's part of where you get this Russia is anti-imperialist idea, because under the Soviet Union there was a lot of outreach to the third world, of course, and constantly trying to make allies in the third world. India being one of those countries. So, maybe some of it goes back to to those days. The other thing, though, is that I think with Modi, the right-wing populists, nationalists around the world have some stuff in common, and I think that that might be in part behind that nice close relationship.
Well, we have time for one more question, if there is one. One more question, last question. Последний вопрос. Okay, Zina, давай, Zina.
So, I already know that you do not want a certain person to return to the presidency. However, I'm curious, and I'm not even asking about any specific candidate, but for this situation, what are qualities that you would hope to see in a potential presidential candidate? Not even asking to identify a specific person, but genuinely just qualities. I'm really curious about this.
We would like to see what qualities of the next
what qualities
US
would you, and imagining an ideal president for the United States for this next election.
A young Biden. A mention. Well, somebody who really knows about the world. I mean, I was a great devotee of Hillary Clinton. She was a terrific Secretary of State. She made some mistakes, but she was a very good Secretary of State, and that was the reason that I thought she would be a good president, because above all, the president has to be able to form alliances, keep alliances, understand what's happening in the world. That's extremely important. And then they have to have a fantastically liberal, progressive, domestic agenda. Well, that's already something. I mean, gosh.
I go along
Thanks
with
for
that.
asking.
I would go along with that. A concern for human rights and democracy. Something that would go a long way. And to tie it back to our conversation, here tonight, to the extent that that Ukraine represents, the war that the fight that Ukraine is putting up against Russia represents an effort to, constrain dictatorships from illegally invading other countries and taking territory. I would like to see the next president continue to support, to support Ukraine.
Yes, right.
And maybe he should be an alto.
I'll just briefly say that the magic trick I'd like our next president to perform would be to somehow link the shoring up of democracy in this country to the efforts to ensure the well-being of democracies overseas. And because I think number 45 that we keep referring to was really someone who was engaging in politics, in strongman politics, the way Putin does, and it scared me, and still scares me, the extent to which it seems that there are citizens of this country who kind of think, that kind of politics is okay, that'll work for me. I want a candidate who's going to be able to show a connection between what we try to do overseas to support democracy and fixing it here as well.
Well, and to get along with countries that aren't democracies and be able to do it.
Right.
Right.
Without being preachy to them, sure. Okay.
Okay, guys.
We shall conclude on
Thank
this
you,
happy
guys.
note.